For a continuous span of 24 months, you controlled the microphone as a representative of the people, yet not once did you hold the actual evidence. The legislative room ceased to produce even the slightest sound. Adam Schiff remained positioned extremely stiffly in his chair, his chin elevated in the precise fashion it perpetually was whenever the broadcast lenses focused upon him. However, a tiny muscle situated high on his cheek had begun to spasm independently, displaying a minuscule, steady flutter that he was completely unable to command to stop. Positioned on the wooden surface directly in front of John Kennedy sat a diminutive, black-colored audio cassette device, the inexpensive variety you might stumble upon within a cluttered junk drawer. Kennedy leaned forward and depressed the rectangular button that caused the tape to pause. The sharp, diminutive click it produced resonated far louder in that cavernous space than the strike of any wooden gavel. Kennedy calmly and softly articulated that the audio they just heard was the representative's own voice. He clarified that he had not forced those statements upon him, but had merely retained the auditory receipts. To truly understand how the specific individual that cable television networks had dedicated 10 years to promoting as the most brilliant investigative mind in the legislature was completely deconstructed by a man he had mocked less than an hour earlier as an amateurish actor from Louisiana, one must rewind the clock approximately 40 minutes. One must return to the exact moment Adam Schiff strode into that hearing room, absolutely certain he possessed the highest intellect of anyone present. He was equally convinced that the deliberately slow-talking gentleman seated across the furniture was someone he could easily disrespect and trample over. Schiff operated under the assumption that he had successfully vanquished opponents with far sharper minds than John Kennedy. He had devoted countless years to appearing on television broadcasts, where the studio lighting is highly flattering and the interviewers never genuinely require you to produce the tangible proof you boast about possessing. He had entirely neglected to remember, assuming he ever truly knew it, that a formal judicial environment and the broader American populace do not function in the exact same manner as a friendly news segment. A television appearance permits you to vaguely promise that the remaining evidence is forthcoming. However, a man exactly like Senator Kennedy, equipped with an inexpensive audio player and possessing infinite patience, forces you to actually display that evidence on the spot. The expansive hearing space was absolutely crammed from wall to wall on that specific morning because a massive confrontation had been heavily advertised. Washington, D.C., as a city, inherently refuses to miss out on witnessing a political brawl. Rumors had circulated widely that Schiff intended to weaponize his introductory comments to launch an assault on the executive administration. It was also known that Kennedy had specifically asked for the opportunity to cross-examine him face-to-face. The journalistic media had positioned the event exactly how they position every event, as a gladiatorial clash. It was billed as the slick, former legal prosecutor hailing from California against the rural, down-to-earth senator hailing from Louisiana who intentionally utilized colloquialisms like ain't. The vast majority of the audience in the room had already predetermined exactly how the proceedings would unfold. The vast majority of the room was completely wrong, though they were entirely unaware of that fact at the time. Adam Schiff was equally unaware. Schiff made his entrance last, adopting the theatrical timing of a main attraction, and took his designated seat as if the entire legislative body had been preserving it exclusively for his arrival. He methodically arranged his written materials, adjusted his optical lenses, and when the committee leader formally gave him the floor, he refused to waste a single second on polite introductory remarks. He had not traveled there to exchange pleasantries. He had arrived to broadcast a prepared monologue. He had recited multiple versions of this exact speech on numerous occasions. He was highly proficient at delivering it, and he possessed an intense internal awareness of his own proficiency. Schiff began by expressing his gratitude to the chairman and his vocal delivery carried that profound, meticulously calculated heaviness he deployed whenever he desired the viewing public to believe a profoundly serious intellectual was communicating. He proclaimed that society currently resides in an incredibly dangerous era. He described it as a period where the fundamental concept of truth is actively being assaulted. He argued that a particular brand of political messaging has conditioned millions of citizens to doubt the evidence of their own vision, to mock established experts, and to view objective facts as merely alternative opinions. They are at liberty to ignore if the information originates from the wrong sort of person. He allowed that dramatic statement to hang in the air. Schiff continued, asserting that there are specific geographic locations in the country where factual reality goes to die. He claimed that in these places, a person can verbalize the most absurd fabrications and receive enthusiastic applause, provided they speak those fabrications using a specific regional dialect inside a specific type of venue, addressing people who have been conditioned to prefer comforting deceptions over clear, factual realities. A muted, rumbling sound reverberated throughout the spectator seating area. This noise did not signify agreement. Rather, it carried a distinct edge of hostility. Schiff audibly detected the sound, but completely misinterpreted it as nervous apprehension. This misinterpretation brought him satisfaction, as inflicting apprehension was exactly what he believed his mission to be. He repositioned his body marginally and allowed his gaze to lock onto Senator Kennedy for the very first time that day, permitting a small, condescending smirk to form on his lips. He announced his intention to be completely transparent regarding his anticipations for the current hearing. He claimed to fully understand exactly how the situation was orchestrated to play out. Schiff declared he had observed the Louisiana senator's theatrical performance previously. He mocked Kennedy's habit of sliding his reading glasses low on his nasal bridge, his reliance on small, rural-sounding idioms that he allegedly wrote in advance and practiced in front of a looking glass, and his overall persona of a rural philosopher. Schiff noted that this specific act generates excellent engagement metrics on social media platforms. His smirk grew even tighter. However, Schiff boasted that he matured professionally within authentic judicial courts, not internet videos. He insisted that in a real courtroom, an individual cannot overcome a panel of jurors merely by deploying a regional dialect and a rural anecdote. He stated that in such environments, one is actually required to possess factual knowledge. Schiff then patronizingly suggested that behaving in a folksy manner is not synonymous with being honest, and that possessing a Southern drawl does not constitute a valid logical argument. He drew a sharp contrast, claiming that while some individuals devoted their entire professional lives to comprehending the mechanics of legal evidence, others merely figured out how to orchestrate a theatrical display for audiences who refused to educate themselves. He claimed these uneducated masses would applaud regardless, simply because the theatrical display allowed them to feel intellectually superior without ever putting in the actual effort required to achieve genuine intelligence. Even judged by Schiff's own personal standards, it was an incredibly shocking series of statements to verbalize in a public forum. He had not simply hurled an insult at the fellow lawmaker seated across the furniture. He had metaphorically reached far past Senator Kennedy, projecting through the broadcast cameras and directly into the residential living spaces of countless small municipalities across the United States. He essentially notified the citizens relaxing in those homes that they were easily manipulated targets. He told them that their enthusiastic cheers were the cheers of gullible fools, and that the exclusive reason they failed to perceive the world exactly as Adam Schiff perceived it was because no authority figure had ever forced them to become smart enough to do so. Furthermore, Schiff articulated these insults using the subdued, distressed, and melancholic vocal register of a person who genuinely believed he was performing a noble public service by being brutally honest about their inherent stupidity. In a mere 3-minute window, he had managed to inform millions of observing Americans watching from their dining areas, workshops, and vehicles that they were simply too unintelligent to differentiate between objective reality and a manufactured stage play. He informed them that their regional ways of speaking immediately rendered them suspicious characters. He accomplished all of this while maintaining the hushed, sorrowful tone of someone who believed himself to be the absolute last honest human being residing in a room completely populated by imbeciles. Schiff was absolutely certain that his rhetorical strike had hit its intended mark. The strike had indeed landed, but he had entirely misidentified the actual target of the blow. If an individual wearing an expensive tailored garment has ever informed you that the way you pronounce words proves your ignorance, and that your belief system only exists because no one educated it out of you, then you understand the profound disrespect. Adam Schiff had just delivered that exact message directly to the viewer's face on live video, and he had the audacity to categorize it as admirable transparency. The rural gentleman whom Schiff had just ruthlessly mocked was preparing to return every single syllable right back at him. John Kennedy did not immediately fire back with a defensive response. This restraint was the very first element Schiff misjudged about his opponent, and it would certainly not be the last. Kennedy remained seated, with his optical lenses positioned low on his nasal bridge, exactly as Schiff had mockingly predicted. His hands remained calmly folded together, resting on the wooden table. He allowed the verbal disrespect to wash over him like a passing weather front. Kennedy had endured far worse names spoken by individuals, far superior to Adam Schiff. Kennedy patiently waited until the presiding official formally granted him speaking privileges. When his moment arrived, he did not grasp for a retaliatory insult, because that simply was not his preferred method of baiting a trap. Instead, he expressed genuine-sounding gratitude toward the man who had just publicly humiliated him. Kennedy addressed him as Congressman Schiff, and his Louisiana accent poured out at a slow, comforting, and warm pace. He thanked Schiff for his opening monologue. Kennedy explicitly stated he harbored absolutely no personal offense. He conceded that Schiff was entirely accurate regarding the low-hanging reading glasses. He offered a self-deprecating anecdote, noting his wife frequently told him he resembled an elderly man struggling to decipher a printed menu inside a poorly lit dining establishment. A gentle wave of laughter rippled through his specific half of the hearing chamber. Kennedy further agreed with Schiff's assessment that he was merely an unsophisticated rural attorney. He humorously claimed he learned his legal trade in a rural judicial building, where the air conditioning system completely broke down every single July, and where the presiding judge had personally baptized 50% of the people serving on the jury. Because of these confessed shortcomings, Kennedy claimed he was going to desperately need Schiff's intellectual assistance that day, entirely due to Schiff's self-proclaimed status as the highly intelligent individual in the room. Kennedy stated his desire to converse about specific statements Schiff had made. He emphasized he wanted to discuss Schiff's own exact vocabulary. Kennedy requested that Schiff aid a slower-thinking man in fully comprehending those words. Schiff, still exuding arrogance, replied that he would be delighted to educate the congressional panel. Kennedy responded that he was sincerely hoping Schiff would adopt that specific stance. Kennedy advised Schiff to maintain that generous educational disposition, warning that they were absolutely going to require it. The fundamental reality regarding a brilliantly constructed ambush is that it never actually resembles an ambush while the victim is actively walking into it. It merely looks like a geriatric man operating at a sluggish pace. Kennedy initiated his line of questioning by referencing the recent past. He noted that Schiff used to appear on television broadcasts with extreme frequency. Kennedy playfully exaggerated, stating he remembered Schiff appearing on screen so constantly that he genuinely started to assume Schiff physically lived inside the television studios. This produced another small round of chuckling in the room. Kennedy then pivoted to the core issue. He stated that Schiff had verbalized a specific claim that had permanently stuck in Kennedy's memory. Kennedy attributed his good memory to his own simplistic nature, noting that simple men tend to hold on to straightforward statements. Kennedy reminded Schiff that he had publicly claimed to have personally viewed concrete evidence of illegal collusion between the chief executive and a sovereign foreign nation. Kennedy stressed that Schiff did not use hesitant words like perhaps, nor did he suggest it was merely a topic worthy of investigation. Instead, Kennedy pointed out Schiff stared directly into the camera lenses, looking the entire American populace in the eye, and emphatically declared he had seen the proof. Kennedy expressed a desire to be perfectly accurate in his quotation. He dramatically peered over the top rims of his spectacles and quoted Schiff's assertion that the evidence was more than circumstantial. Kennedy emphasized that those were Schiff's exact chosen words. He directly asked Schiff if he possessed any memory of speaking that specific phrase. Schiff responded with noticeable caution, addressing Kennedy as congressman and stating he remembered that historical period quite well. Schiff attempted to deflect by describing a highly serious investigation concerning a severe threat to the nation's democratic system. He accused Kennedy's political party of spending years actively trying to obstruct that very investigation. Kennedy immediately cut off the deflection. He told Schiff that was not the question he had asked. Kennedy's voice contained absolutely zero warmth during this exchange. It was simply a flat, unwavering correction, delivered in the exact manner an adult would gently but firmly redirect a wandering toddler back to a coloring book. Kennedy reiterated his specific inquiry. Did Schiff remember utilizing the exact phrase, more than circumstantial? Kennedy asked if Schiff had actually spoken those words into existence, or if Kennedy's own mind had simply hallucinated the event. Schiff firmly stated that he stood by every single comment he made during that historical window. Kennedy reacted with extreme satisfaction. He nodded his head in a slow, rhythmic motion, looking exactly like a fisherman who had just been handed the perfect type of bait. Kennedy expressed immense relief at Schiff's confirmation. He explained that he deeply desired to present Schiff with a golden opportunity right there in front of the gathered audience and the cameras to finally reveal to everyone the more he had previously promised. Kennedy reminded Schiff that the entire nation had waited in suspense for 2 whole years based on his claims. Kennedy declared that the waiting period was officially over. He demanded to know exactly what the evidence was. He asked Schiff to explicitly detail the proof that elevated the situation to being more than circumstantial, asking to be guided through the information step by step. At that exact moment, for the very first time that morning, the mask of supreme confidence physically slipped from Adam Schiff's face. Schiff stuttered, claiming Kennedy's request was a massive oversimplification of an incredibly complex issue. Kennedy interrupted, stating it was a remarkably straightforward question. Schiff attempted to hide behind the findings of the Mueller investigation, claiming the official report detailed extensive connections between the Trump campaign and Russian operatives. Kennedy verbally batted the word connections around as if he were examining a small stone. He sharply clarified that he had not asked about mere contacts. Kennedy pointed out that he personally knew people who maintained contact with a wide variety of unsavory characters, but that fact alone did not automatically transform them into criminals. Kennedy hammered home that his question was specifically regarding the crime of collusion. He demanded to see the specific item Schiff had sworn he possessed the proof that was more than circumstantial. He once again ordered Schiff to reveal the more. It is crucial to observe Kennedy's tactical approach during this exchange. He never resorted to screaming. He never engaged in petty name-calling. He was simply politely demanding that the man across from him produce one solitary piece of evidence that he had previously sworn to the entire country he already possessed in his hands. And Schiff was completely incapable of producing it. As Schiff opened his mouth to once again attempt a deflection toward his familiar, solemn speech about democratic norms and impending perils, Kennedy executed a maneuver that absolutely no one in the room had predicted. Schiff Schiff was the most surprised of all. Moving with his trademark sluggishness, Kennedy reached his arm downward and retrieved a tiny, black-colored cassette audio player, placing it squarely on his wooden desk. Kennedy gazed at the plastic device for a brief second, looking at it with the affection a musician might reserve for a favorite weathered guitar. Using one of his thick fingers, Kennedy depressed a button on the machine. A distinct sound immediately filled the hearing room. The audio quality was thin and slightly metallic as it strained through the cheap internal speaker, but the voice was unmistakably clear. It was Adam Schiff's own voice. It was a recording of a slightly younger, supremely secure, and absolutely certain version of Schiff speaking on a brightly lit television stage while the entire nation tuned in. The recorded voice of Schiff declared that he could inform the public that the situation was far more severe than previously thought. The recording stated that while he could not delve into the specific details at that moment, there was absolutely more than circumstantial evidence currently in existence. After the clip finished, Kennedy pressed the stop button. He allowed the faint echo of that younger, more arrogant voice to hang in the silent room for a moment. Kennedy calmly identified the voice on the tape as Schiff's. Kennedy noted that his staff had informed him the audio clip originated from a television program titled Meet the Press. He humorously added that he rarely watched that specific program down in his hometown of Madisonville, Louisiana. He joked that his local television reception primarily consisted of weather forecasts and broadcasts of local high school athletic events. A handful of people in the audience chuckled at the self-deprecating humor. Kennedy himself did not laugh. Kennedy's demeanor shifted to intense focus. He leaned in and explained what had been causing a simple country lawyer like himself to lose sleep at night. He highlighted Schiff's recorded claim that he could not delve into the specifics. Kennedy zeroed in on Schiff's desperate use of the word specifics. Kennedy conceded that at the time the statement was originally made, he thought it was perfectly reasonable. He acknowledged that an investigator cannot publicly reveal all their confidential evidence while an active probe is still ongoing. Kennedy noted that he and the rest of the nation understood and respected that procedural limitation. Because they respected the process, Kennedy noted, the public had patiently waited for Schiff to deliver on his promises. He folded his hands together on the desk surface. Kennedy then delivered the crushing reality check. The investigation was officially concluded. He emphasized that it had been over for a very long period of time. The special counsel, Mr. Mueller, had packed up and gone home. The final exhaustive report had been drafted and published. Therefore, Kennedy argued, there was absolutely no legal or procedural barrier left in the entire world that prevented Schiff from finally delving into the exact specifics he had previously hidden. Kennedy aggressively invited him to proceed without hesitation. He declared that the American public was completely finished waiting. Kennedy offered him the floor, noted that the broadcast cameras were actively recording, and stated the whole country was finally ready to hear the truth. He sharply demanded to know, what exactly were the specifics? The muscle in Schiff's cheek began to twitch once more. His hand blindly searched for the edge of his leather binder and clamped down on it tightly. Schiff attempted to answer, but his vocal tone had radically transformed. It was now strained, overly cautious, and distinctly lawyer-like. All the grandiose, righteous melody had been completely drained from his delivery. He began to argue that the investigation had successfully proven a pattern of concerning behavior that any logical observer would find troubling. Kennedy aggressively cut him off. He demanded specifics, not vague patterns or descriptions of behavior. Kennedy rejected Schiff's attempt to substitute what a logical fellow might assume for hard evidence. Kennedy's vocal volume never increased by even a fraction of a decibel, maintaining its flat, devastating calmness. He reminded Schiff that he had sworn to the nation that he possessed concrete specifics. Kennedy pointed out that Schiff was the one who originally used that exact word, which had just been broadcast back to him. Kennedy summarized his request. He was merely asking Schiff to honor a solemn vow he had made on live television to an audience of 200 million citizens. He asked for the final time what those specifics actually were. Confronted with an impossible demand, Schiff reverted to his primary survival tactic, retreating to the moral high ground. He sought refuge in a rhetorical space where the atmosphere was thin, the perspective was elevated, and the messy, contradictory details were obscured far below. Schiff firmly locked his jaw muscles and summoned his most serious, dramatic vocal tone. He aimed this tone directly past Kennedy's face and straight into the lenses of the television cameras, the environment where he always felt most protected. Schiff declared his belief that the American populace deserved far better treatment than what was currently transpiring. The tone of mournful, injured pride had completely returned to his voice. He accused the sitting senator of transforming a serious legislative session into a cheap carnival simply to score partisan political points with his uneducated base. Schiff fiercely defended his actions, claiming there had been a massive and genuine threat to the Democratic Republic. He vowed he would never offer an apology for treating that threat with the utmost gravity, especially when other politicians in that very room had cowardly chosen to ignore it. He proclaimed that the long arc of history would ultimately judge who had stood on the correct side of the issue. Kennedy calmly agreed that history would indeed make a judgment. However, he pointed out with a hint of dark humor that history also requires specific, concrete facts in order to render those judgments. The hearing chamber erupted into laughter once more, and this time the laughter was noticeably louder and more widespread. The audience was beginning to recognize the overarching dynamic of the confrontation. They saw how the elderly senator continuously served up the exact same dish of accountability, and how Schiff continually fabricated new excuses to avoid consuming it. At this precise moment, Kennedy discarded all remaining pleasantries. For the very first time, the folksy, grandfatherly warmth completely vanished from his voice. Beneath it, a cold, flat, and uncompromising tone emerged. It was the tone of a man who had entirely stopped being amused. Kennedy announced he was going to explain his own theory of what had actually transpired over the past 2 years. He challenged Schiff to correct him if his theory was inaccurate, mockingly reminding him of his self-proclaimed intellectual superiority. Kennedy outlined his devastating theory. He accused Schiff of appearing on evening broadcast programs night after night, deliberately feeding lies to a terrified American public. He claimed Schiff told the nation he had viewed secret evidence that he had never actually seen. Kennedy theorized that Schiff utilized the phrase "more than circumstantial" simply because it made him look like a powerful insider guarding a dark secret. And as Kennedy accurately noted, a politician who claims to possess a dark secret is guaranteed to be invited back onto the television program the following night. Kennedy continued, stating his belief that Schiff knew the truth the entire time. He argued that deep within Schiff's core, he was fully aware that if anyone ever forced him to lay his cards on the table, he would have an entirely empty hand. Kennedy paused for dramatic effect. He then declared that the moment of reckoning had finally arrived, and true to form, Schiff had absolutely nothing to present. Schiff furiously objected, calling Kennedy's accusation a shameful misrepresentation of the facts. Kennedy instantly countered, demanding that Schiff correct the representation by finally revealing the more he had promised. Kennedy had just vocalized the exact suspicion that half the nation had harbored for years, that Schiff knowingly lied because the lie fueled his personal popularity. The situation was about to deteriorate even further for Schiff. The rural senator was not finished. He possessed a second audio recording. Kennedy reached down to the cassette player and extracted a second tape. He held it up between his thumb and forefinger, displaying it to the room like a proud fisherman showing off his latest catch. He inserted the second tape and pressed the play mechanism. The thin, metallic audio once again echoed through the room, but this clip originated from a different broadcast during a different week. In this second recording, the exact same voice, Schiff's voice, clearly stated that the available evidence was merely circumstantial and absolutely nothing more than that. Kennedy hit the stop button. He allowed the heavy silence to wash over the room once again. Kennedy then feigned deep confusion, looking for all the world like a man genuinely struggling to understand a complex paradox. He pointed out that the second tape was recorded just a few days prior to the first one. Kennedy highlighted the chronological discrepancy. In the first instance, the evidence was strictly circumstantial. Yet, a mere handful of days later, the exact same evidence had miraculously evolved into being more than circumstantial. He emphasized the impossibility. It was the exact same pool of evidence, reviewed by the exact same man, within roughly the exact same calendar week. Kennedy slowly removed his glasses. He asked the congressman to help a simple country lawyer understand how legal evidence physically expands in size over a single weekend. He sarcastically inquired if the evidence had been fed a particularly nutritious meal. Kennedy noted that based on his extensive legal background, physical evidence does not spontaneously grow. He stated that only fabricated stories grow over time. The evidence itself remains exactly the same size it always was, which, in Schiff's specific case, Kennedy concluded, appeared to be absolutely non-existent. The laughter that erupted from the room this time was laced with genuine cruelty. It was the sound of a room that had finally realized the man they had been conditioned to respect was entirely hollow when tapped upon. Further down the committee table, a seasoned Democratic lawmaker who had served for 2 decades and had no future elections to worry about losing leaned toward his own microphone. Crucially, he chose not to defend his embattled colleague. The veteran Democrat stated in a deeply exhausted tone that the Mueller document definitively failed to prove any illegal cooperation. He noted that this fact was explicitly written in the report, and while they could argue about other interpretations, that specific fact was undeniable. He then leaned back in his chair. That small act of betrayal, the deliberate refusal to throw a drowning colleague a life preserver, communicated more loudly than any prepared speech. Schiff's own political faction had made the collective decision not to go down with his sinking ship. As a junior staff member sitting behind Schiff whispered frantically, Schiff began to scramble for his familiar defense mechanism. He tried to portray himself as the victim of an aggressive, powerful white man who was bullying him to create a media circus. Kennedy shut down this defense before it could even fully form, and he did so without ever raising his vocal volume. Kennedy preemptively addressed any accusation that he was merely grandstanding for his conservative voters. He stated he wanted to be perfectly transparent about a crucial point. He declared he held the absolute highest level of respect for the citizens who had elected him to office. He reminded Schiff that just 10 minutes prior, Schiff had essentially called those very same citizens uneducated fools. Kennedy recalled Schiff's claim that truth goes to Kennedy's region of the country specifically to die. Kennedy drew a sharp distinction. He had not insulted Schiff's voters, but Schiff had insulted Kennedy's voters on live video. Therefore, Kennedy warned Schiff not to pretend that Kennedy was the one who had entered the room looking down on the populace. A woman seated in the public gallery, wearing a jacket, spontaneously began clapping her hands before she could stop herself. Several others quickly joined in the applause, forcing the committee chairman to repeatedly strike his gavel to restore order. Throughout this humiliation, Schiff remained seated, his jaw tightly clenched, his eyes glassy and unmoving. Kennedy pushed forward, revealing what truly upset him about the entire ordeal. He picked up the tape player again, casually flipping it over in his hand. He admitted that he wasn't even primarily angry that Schiff had initially spoken the lies. Kennedy acknowledged that men often say reckless things in the heat of a political battle, admitting he was guilty of doing so himself. What truly disgusted Kennedy was Schiff's behavior after the fact. He was disgusted by what Schiff said after the official report was published, after the entire conspiracy theory had completely collapsed, and after it was definitively proven that no collusion existed. Kennedy looked directly at Schiff. He recounted a specific instance where a journalist had directly asked Schiff a clear question. The journalist asked if Schiff regretted his choice of words and if he wished he hadn't told the country he possessed more than circumstantial evidence. Kennedy asked if Schiff remembered his own response, noting that he certainly did. Kennedy slowly read from a prepared note to ensure absolute accuracy. He stated that Schiff had arrogantly replied that his words were completely accurate and precise. Schiff had then claimed that the only reason the public believed otherwise was because the president had successfully brainwashed them. Kennedy placed the note back on his desk. Kennedy asked for clarification to ensure he understood the logic. He pointed out the fundamental contradiction. The official report stated zero collusion was proven, yet Schiff claimed he had seen proof of it. Both statements could not exist as truth simultaneously. One was mathematically false, and yet, when offered a graceful exit ramp to admit he had perhaps exaggerated his claims, Schiff aggressively refused to take it. Instead of apologizing, Schiff doubled down on the deception. He insisted he was factually correct and that the entire nation was simply too foolish and manipulated to realize it. Kennedy slowly shook his head in disgust. He stated that Schiff's reaction was not the behavior of a man who had made an honest mistake. A man who makes a mistake readily admits to it. Schiff's behavior was that of a man who would much rather brand 200 million people as naive idiots than force himself to utter three simple words, "I was wrong." Kennedy observed that Schiff couldn't find the courage to say those three words back then, and he suspected Schiff still couldn't find them now. He challenged Schiff to try and apologize, offering to wait patiently. Kennedy reminded him he was highly skilled at waiting. However, Schiff offered absolute silence. His jaw remained stubbornly elevated. The three words of apology never materialized. Schiff was incapable of apologizing even after a comprehensive report had cleared the accused, and he remained incapable of doing so on live television with the nation watching. Kennedy allowed the silence to stretch, forcing the room to absorb the visual of a man too proud to admit fault. Then, Kennedy's vocal tone shifted for the final time. All traces of dark humor vanished, leaving behind a solemn, flat, and intensely serious cadence that compelled the entire room to lean forward. Kennedy announced he was done being humorous. He stated there was a critical aspect of this situation that was absolutely not funny, and the citizens watching at home deserved to hear him articulate it clearly. He pushed the audio player aside. Kennedy told Schiff that he hadn't merely gotten a minor fact wrong. Everyone gets things wrong occasionally, which isn't a crime. It's simply human nature. However, Kennedy argued Schiff's actions were far more malicious. Schiff had taken an unverified, sensational claim and deliberately force-fed it to a terrified populace, piece by piece, over a 2-year period. He rationed out the fear on a weekly basis, always providing just enough to keep the public panicked and tuning in, but never providing enough actual substance to prove the claim. And while Schiff was executing this media strategy, the Democratic Republic was violently ripping itself apart at the seams. Kennedy paused before continuing in an even softer voice. He clarified he was no longer discussing standard political maneuvering, which he dismissed as mere shouting. He was talking about real-world devastation. He provided specific, heartbreaking examples. He mentioned a father in Ohio who stopped attending family Thanksgiving dinners because his daughter married a man with opposing political views, whom the father had been convinced by people exactly like Schiff was practically a foreign spy. He mentioned 2 brothers in Louisiana who had successfully run a commercial shrimp boat together for 3 decades, but who now refused to speak to one another over a political narrative that turned out to be entirely fabricated. Kennedy painted a picture of a nation filled with citizens who were instructed every single night by a serious-looking man on their television sets that their own neighbors were treasonous traitors and that their elected leader was a foreign asset. They were repeatedly told that the conclusive evidence was on its way, that it was imminent, and that it was more than circumstantial. Kennedy let the weight of that reality sink in. Half of the United States was brainwashed into believing they had elected a foreign agent, while the other half was branded as treasonous idiots for daring to question that narrative. For 2 entire years, this toxic rhetoric was slowly leaked into the public consciousness, and Schiff was the man holding the poison bottle. He maintained a grave expression while continually swearing that the concrete proof was arriving shortly. Kennedy's voice dropped to a near whisper, forcing the room into absolute silence to hear him. He noted that the promised proof never arrived, simply because it never existed in the first place. Schiff only possessed a catchy phrase he liked to repeat, a trusting public, and a television media apparatus that adored him. That was the entire sum of his evidence. Kennedy stated his firm belief that Schiff knew the entire time that there was absolutely nothing more to reveal. This, Kennedy noted, was the part he could not find humor in, despite his ability to laugh at almost anything else. The hearing chamber was now completely paralyzed. Kennedy addressed Schiff's earlier complaints about threats to the Republic. Kennedy offered a real threat, a powerful man exploiting the public's trust to intentionally pit American citizens against each other purely for television ratings. Kennedy asked rhetorically how much money a hostile foreign enemy would have gladly paid to achieve the exact same level of internal division that Schiff had caused. He suggested a foreign power would have bankrupted itself trying to fracture the country so thoroughly. Yet, Schiff accomplished this destruction for absolutely no cost. He did it merely in exchange for broadcast airtime. Kennedy refused to explicitly label Schiff a traitor, noting it was a massive accusation he didn't throw around lightly. But he did conclude that America's enemies could never have inflicted the damage Schiff caused. He noted that every time Schiff went on television and falsely claimed he had more than circumstantial evidence, an enemy who wanted to see America destroyed smiled and celebrated because Schiff was doing their destructive work for them far better than they ever could. No one in the room laughed at this brutal assessment. No one clapped. The statement sank into the deep, uncomfortable space where a collective group holds its simmering anger. Kennedy had finally said the quiet part out loud. The national damage wasn't an accidental byproduct. A man who swore an oath to protect the nation had spent 2 years actively performing the exact psychological warfare that the nation's worst enemies constantly dream of executing. He had willfully peddled terror. Adam Schiff attempted a final, desperate defense by elevating his chin and adopting a solemn tone to preach about historical vindication. However, the room's atmosphere had irrevocably changed. Even Schiff recognized this shift as his words were met with absolute, unyielding silence. Journalists ceased taking notes, while his political allies stared intently at their desks to avoid any eye contact. The polished rhetoric that had previously sustained him was now failing spectacularly. Lacking a sympathetic audience, he felt his arguments dying in midair, resembling a driver turning the ignition of a broken vehicle. Agonizingly, the cameras watched as he continued speaking. He grasped for dramatic phrases because his entire persona relied on theatrical performance, leaving him nothing genuine to use. Stopping meant admitting his utter emptiness. Kennedy allowed him to exhaust his words without interruption, displaying a brutal form of judgment. When Schiff quieted, the chamber offered nothing, no nods or support. Breaking the quiet, Kennedy leaned forward and turned the small tape player. He delivered the fatal blow, reminding Schiff that he had monopolized the nation's attention for 2 years. Kennedy summarized the ordeal with a crushing phrase, "You did not trick a nation, you peddled one." Those 8 words inflicted devastating damage. Panicking, Schiff reached for a binder. His fingers nervously drummed the wood, creating the room's only sound. Realizing his exposure, he forcefully pressed his trembling hand flat against the table. He stubbornly refused to let his face betray his ruin. He offered zero apologies and displayed absolutely no surrender. He sat isolated within a space that once cheered him, declining to provide a final reply when asked. That broadcast image of a lonely, rigid, and trembling Adam Schiff defined the entire evening across all American television screens by the time supper time arrived for the viewing public. The confrontation echoed very far beyond the committee walls. Before attendees even departed, television news networks had christened the viral video clip The Specifics. The footage cleanly juxtaposed his past refusal to share details with a calm demand for them. The most devastating element for Schiff was the complete absence of partisan debate. Viewers merely witnessed an arrogant politician who had insulted their intelligence, dismantled by an unassuming country lawyer wielding undeniable audio evidence. Evening broadcasts relentlessly looped the contradictory statements, highlighting the utter impossibility of evidence evolving over a single weekend. In the chaotic marble hallways, the facade crumbled further. A nervous Democratic strategist, responsible for media appearances, confessed a dark reality. He admitted that Washington insiders always knew Schiff possessed zero tangible proof. The entire spectacle was a calculated routine designed exclusively to inflate viewership and drive campaign donations. Another veteran operative agreed, noting the tragedy was not his initial belief in the allegations, but his deliberate choice to continue peddling falsehoods to elevate his personal brand. He displayed absolutely zero remorse, projecting only the bitter anger of a man publicly exposed. Contrastingly, Senator John Kennedy embraced his monumental victory with absolute silence. Rejecting the standard performative theatricality, he offered no victorious smirk or triumphant press conference. Kennedy simply collected the two inexpensive cassettes, handling them with the casual indifference of a fisherman packing up discarded bait. Slipping the plastic rectangles into his suit jacket, he slowly exited the echoing chamber. He completely ignored the frantic journalists and walked directly past the paralyzed, disgraced figure of Adam Schiff. The sole noise accompanying the stoic Louisiana attorney was his own footsteps and the faint rattling of two cheap tapes that had successfully demolished a powerful political legacy in minutes.